Welcome everyone to Revolutionizing Healthcare session 48. This will be the final session for the year, and we hope to have a really eye-opening session for you to close the year off. Today we'll be discussing about why don't clinicians and ML researchers work together more, with a focus on benchmark. And in today's session, it'll really be about unpacking why benchmarks are vital but rare, and how this gap might be meaningfully closed. And in today's session, we will be going through with a small introduction by Professor Eoin McKinney, as well as presentations by Chris, Dr. Chen, and Dr. Tom Callender. And we'll be moving on towards a panel discussion. And furthermore, we are really delighted to be joined today by three amazing collaborators of the CCAM, as well as a wonderful guest today. So we have Professor Eoin McKinney, who is the professor in Department of Medicine at the University of Cambridge, as well as Dr. Tom Callender, who is a clinical research fellow at the Department of Public Health and Primary Care. And finally, we are joined by Dr. Chen, who is Associate Principal AI Scientist at Astrazeneca. And with that, I would like to hand over the floor to Professor Eoin McKinney.
Many thanks, Marika, and thanks very much for joining, everybody. I'm going to keep this introduction brief because it's exactly that. It's an introduction. Really looking forward to the three talks, and then we're going to go straight into panel discussion. Quick introduction to benchmarks. Lots of you will probably be familiar with this. One of the standard benchmarks that has been used for many, many years to train ML models in. It's the MNIST data set. It has over 60,000 characters of handwritten text. That's a benchmark. It's well accepted, it's well understood, and people can train models that can differentiate between the different characters involved in it. And the same sort of thing has been applied to medicine again and again. And here you see a recent example from Nature showing LLM model performance, different model performance on predicting future disease onset from Biobank, UK Biobank, another very established, very accepted data set that many different researchers use. And you can see from both of these examples that benchmark data sets, so large data sets that are freely accessible, that people can build models on and can model different outcomes, can be very useful to the community. When you start getting into the weeds and thinking about benchmarks and what actually defines a benchmark, it's not as straightforward as you might think. There are some very well established benchmarks in medicine. So in medicine, it's the concept of a standard of care is quite well established. Many clinical trials will use standard of care as their comparator for a new treatment. In other words, the best we can currently do. And a benchmark really needs to encapsulate the best that medicine can do. It has to be held up as a gold standard data set that's well accepted. Mimic is probably one of the best examples of that in the public domain. As you can see, it's freely accessible. It's a full electronic healthcare record level data set. And it has become one of the accepted benchmarks for medical data modeling. But as we'll discuss over the next hour or so, medical standards of care are complicated. They're difficult. Defining exactly what constitutes a standard of care is not straightforward. They are, however, necessary. If you could define one way in which you can promote interaction with the machine learning community, coming up with a benchmark data set that is accepted, that is authoritative, and is represents very well a particular context or condition, that will allow many people to queue up, come along and test their models on your benchmark data set. So if you want to accelerate research in your particular area or condition, you could do a lot worse than coming up with a benchmark data set for it. So it's a great way of accelerating innovation, also facilitating replication. If we're all using the same data, we know exactly how performant our models are. But in order for something to be a benchmark, it has to become accepted. It has to be authoritative. It has to be easily accessible and therefore transparent. And it has to be representative. And those are not easy things to achieve necessarily. I should say there are many medical data sets out there. There are over 5,500 on Kaggle alone. That doesn't mean there are 5,500 benchmarks. So one of the things that we're going to consider over the next hour or so is what makes a benchmark a benchmark. And in order to stimulate that discussion, we're going to have the three talks. So we're going to start with Chris, then go through Chen, and then on to Tom before the discussion. So I'll pass on to Chris without any further ado. Thanks, Chris.
Probably going to give a really good introduction just now on, I guess, from a medical like point of view, and I guess like me as someone in between, I will maybe discuss, I guess, the path towards data set to benchmark, and also really just to encourage, I guess, collaboration between healthcare and machine learning researchers, and also like I guess a more machine learning side on what defines the benchmark. So firstly, yeah, I think we've made a slight distinction there already that data set and even data itself is very different already. But then afterwards, we're then between data set and benchmark is also extremely distinct. And in the sense that, so firstly, I guess we all have a good idea that we, and especially in healthcare, generate a ton of data, which are all, most of it is unstructured. And then afterwards, a lot of us have either been using or even actively been participating in the whole movement in healthcare towards, I guess, publishing more data sets, towards actually open data movement to make sure that everyone is on board and everyone has good data sets to either train models on or to understand the problem space or to actually just do any sort of research. So that's when we convert from unstructured to structured data. But then, yeah, as Eoin has mentioned just now, like, data set itself is not a benchmark. So then what is a benchmark? I think the one distinction is that whether there is something that we can consider a real ground truth, whether there is something that actually you can either test a model on, test some sort of machine learning models against in order to assess whether it is actually useful in a very specific task. So the last thing is that it needs to be to some extent have a specific task, because then otherwise it's the benchmark itself is not a it's not really testing for anything. It's really the equivalent of if you're doing a medical exam, you want to test for something. A benchmark is essentially really I'll consider a medical exam, but for like any sort of like intelligent machine learning models. So here is a quick example, just left side. This is just data. If you give me 1,000 scans, I can train anything. I can do some unstructured learning. I can do clustering. I can maybe do segmentations for you. But then if my model can identify the lesion that is highlighted on the right, which is either validated by someone or manually annotated by, say, another radiologist, then this will only be a data set and not be a benchmark. So then the question is, what really makes a good benchmark? So I mentioned a few characteristics earlier, but I think in general there are a few ways. Like I say, I think both machine learning researchers and healthcare researchers could probably both agree on. Firstly, a benchmark needs to be verifiable in that, like, there needs to be an absolute ground truth that everybody can agree on. And I think especially in healthcare, sometimes this makes things very difficult, because the joke in my previous work is that if you show one scan to 5 radiologists, you get 6 answers. So sometimes that is hard, and this is where you want expert to review, such that when you have someone to actually then decide on what is the tiebreaker, what is this, like, say one scan might, even if there are 6 answers, maybe there are 3 answers that are better than the other 3. And then in which case, your verifiable ground truth might be, one for these 3 answers and say 0.5 of these answers. That's one of the things we used to do to have these benchmarks to decide on, like, how to verify it, and also how to expect, and then the expert input would be then to provide these things for such as a gradient, such that the answer is also well defined. And another thing is, like, I personally, this is more personal, but I think a benchmark also needs to reflect real life use cases. And I'll give you some examples soon that do not, and why those are not good benchmarks. But lastly, I think they also need to be scalable, in that a benchmark that, like, in my opinion, can't just be limited to a single data set, but it needs to be something that is actually a lot more scalable, that everyone else can put their data set in. For example, if let's say I have a very custom healthcare system that is well defined, but only works for, say, there's one data set, and this benchmark only reflects, what is the best way to prescribe antibiotics in this one county in the United Kingdom. That won't be a very good benchmark for someone else trying to explore infectious diseases in, say, West Africa. So it needs to be scalable in terms of the data, in the define of the domain, and also needs to be scalable in terms of, if I put more data in, would this benchmark be more robust? And lastly, in my opinion, it also needs to be accessible, in that a lot of the current data sets, like, are very closed source. And I think one of the, I guess, movement that we have been having already is open data sets. And I think in general, benchmark as well, optimally in the long run, would need to be open source and accessible to all. So I want to bring up two case studies. One is one of the best papers from last year's NEURIPS, and one is the publication from our lab recently. So the first one is this one is a benchmark called Metcalfe bench, which I think it's one of those things that's quite elegant. And when I read the paper, I wished I did it myself because it's a very neat idea. So what they did is essentially they took up MD-Cal, which some of you might use yourself, which is a medical calculator, and then they extracted some medical tasks from it, which is like essentially in a sort of calculation. Then they had a bunch of patient notes. They manually curated them, and then they quite literally just give a patient note with a validated score to the model, and the task here is where the LLMs can pass the medical data and then literally just do the math. For example, I can just give you a patient note. You can see, and then I will see if GPT-5 can calculate the CHA2DS2-VASc score for me. And I think this is nice because going back to the definition here, it's verifiable. It was manually reviewed by a person. It is actually reflecting real life use cases because you can imagine how, like it's one thing to say, oh, like you can imagine how in the future, let's say LLMs actually take over the whole healthcare system. If in real time you can show you already the CHA2DS2-VASc score instead of you say taking off the phone to calculate, it might save some people some time, might be useful. And also it is accessible and scalable because you can put in more questions. You can, expand the data, and it's also well defined. So I personally think that's quite neat, and that's one of the examples. And the other one is, so the other tangent is, instead of a neat idea, is what I think is addressing a gap. And this is a paper that our lab published recently, and this is a benchmark called Viva Bench. So what this benchmark does is that it is a multi-turn clinical reasoning data benchmark. So instead of having traditional benchmarks will be a single question, single answer QA kind of thing, where you're really just testing for knowledge. Whereas for Viva Bench, what we're doing is we're simulating a Viva Voce examination. So what our benchmark does is we will probe the LLM with a very simple patient prompt, similar to what you do with patient OSCE. You give them, say, 35-year-old came in with some sort of abdominal pain, for example. Then afterwards, the LLM will actually need to actively seek information, and then afterwards it will need to describe to you what they will do, either history or examination, or even just ordering investigations. But then they will need to, as a result, reason on the incomplete information rather than the full picture. And so this is an illustrative example on how on the left side, the LLM actually went down the normal abdominal pathway because they really wasn't thinking of, okay, what if it's actually something else more sinister, like the classic screening, whereas on the right side they did, and then they managed to diagnose an inferior myocardial infarction, which the left side would have missed, and naturally that would be terrible. So so this is another one of the benchmarks that address one of the more unmet gaps in the market. And then I think I think both are, and this one and Metcalfe bench both would fit what I would consider I guess a good medical benchmark. And also most importantly, both are using publicly available data to then convert from public data sets into benchmarks. But despite all of this, I think right now within the industry and within the research community, there is a lot, and I say emphasize, really a lot of really nice low-hanging fruit, even of good opportunities of basically and this essentially what this, I guess, whole hour is about, is a call for increased collaboration between healthcare researchers and medical and machine learning researchers in terms of how do we come together leveraging the domain expertise of all of us medical experts to work with the ML researchers to actually come up with better benchmarks. And why would that be useful for both communities, right? So firstly, I think the current medical benchmarks are actually genuinely insufficient, in the sense that, like, for example, most large language model benchmarks right now for medical is literally over 2,000 USMLE questions. Those are like, everybody would be testing on that. And even for, say, vision encoders, etc., recently, the most recent paper from another group, they literally had this, they very pompously said, they called their benchmark a radiologist's last exam. And guess what? They only had 50 scans that are not even fully human reviewed, and they do not reflect real life use. So current ones are insufficient in both difficulty and also in terms of how grounded in actual reality they are. And I think without guidance with healthcare, like the ML community can easily just go onto that path, and then they will keep on building products that no, none of us won, and I guess that's not very good. I guess another thing is obviously naturally the scientific contribution, i.e., I guess publication potential and grant money, etc. But I guess most importantly, this collaboration would really allow for hard problems to be solved, and also would allow for, I guess, general awareness. And for lack of a better expression, if you put your data set on cargo that is well defined, these machine learning researchers will work for you for free. Like for example, RSNA, they have been doing this for the last 5, 6, 8 years already. And each year they have a challenge, and then tons of people come in, they solve really hard radiology problems. The winner gets like a nominal sum, and then they flew over to Chicago to present. But realistically, the value they bring in is way more than what the $30,000 here. And I think overall, it's a great bargain for everybody, and it's a fun challenge for us machine learning researchers as well. So in general, yeah. So I guess lastly, this is the last extra slide. As a very quick overview, this is quite literally the current landscape of what all the benchmarks there are. So it's a little dense, but essentially this paper is called MedHelm, and this is a group benchmark, and this from Stanford, and this list of benchmark is quite literally what everybody is using right now for the next year. I reckon that they'll be using in order for the benchmarks to test for medical large language models. And if you quickly look at it, you can see how deficient it really is, right? Like firstly, there is private data sets, gated data sets, and then a lot of them are like, using mimic free. A lot of them are like, using things that are really not relevant. A lot of them are mostly text. So yeah, I think there is a lot more room for a lot more benchmarks to be developed. And I'm very keen for next hour to discuss how we can really, work together potentially to make this happen. And yeah, that's all from me. Thanks so much.
But before I jump to the actual demo, so a little bit background. So this is out of the a hackathon we have at AstraZeneca, an agentic AI hackathon, just last week. So right out of the oven, and this project we built actually won the first uh, prize across 10 teams. So the general idea, I think, at highest level, I guess everyone know we can only improve what we can measure, and actually, building benchmark is so important for ML because it defines the upper bound of your model, and then we talk about three bottlenecks, like bottlenecks from three point of view. The first one is from a clinician or domain experts point of view. Often, our experts see tremendous advancements in the ML field. In our domain, we have an example of Biomi, which we have great interest internally. Our domain experts are very interested, but slightly struggle to further evaluate it, because often those models provide some results based on external benchmark, but there's a misalignment with internal needs. Um, so, however, those domain experts may not necessarily have ML knowledge, so they can't contribute to the actual benchmark. They have great domain expertise knowledge, but it's difficult to turn them into verifiable, scalable evaluations. And then secondly, from a developer point of view, we develop AI solutions, but because we cannot rely on external benchmark, then the gold standard is directly reviewed by our internal experts, which is again not scalable. So an ideal solution would be how can we turn this valuable know-how into reusable benchmark? And lastly, from a leader point of view, they want to easily retrieve results. So therefore, we propose this builder bench is a agentic solution. So it has three parts: benchmark builder, evaluation agent, and leaderboard. So this benchmark builder essentially it switches the role. It asks the language model to propose a set of benchmark question and answers, providing context, some existing benchmark and then it will generate a set of question and answering following the structure. So, for example, I can say diabetes QA and ask for advanced QA in diabetes. Yeah, you can optionally ask for add some additional context, but it's not necessary. So right now, yeah, you prompt essentially is the language model will generate the initial draft of a set of question and answering, and then experts can change the answer, can review, and you can approve and add, and then it will directly reflect it in the evaluation agents. So here what you see, so apart from a set of existing external benchmarks, so we have this diabetes QA. So because I have run this a few times before, so before it have like 14 QAs, now it's 19. So the new ones being added. And then you can connect to a different endpoints, language model essentially. And so right now we're using an internal one, and we can just run a quick test. It will take probably half minutes to up to 1 minute to get results. But the general idea is like this is a more scalable solution to us to retrieve the valuable know-how from our experts, and is scalable as well. Yeah, I will not wait this because I think it will finish in a bit. But in the interest of time, I will skip. So right, guess it's not happy. I can come back to this. Maybe because yeah, it's come up. So right here we can basically visualize different model performance. For example, we can also filter based on task. This one have been run previously, so 199 questions. For the task, we can compare GPT, Qwen, different model, their performance and runtime. Yeah, so this is just a very initial effort with a multiple QA as an initial effort example to show how this would work. But our vision is we really want to ask for collaboration. I think this is a global challenge for the community in healthcare, and we should all, clinicians and ML experts, should all work together on this at scale. Thank you.
So I am going to be the party pooper, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the difficulties that I think that there are that we ought to address, because without kind of looking at some of these risks and why we're currently in the position that we are, it's not that we don't necessarily know about benchmarks or these model data sets. We might have different terms for them, but there's an awful lot of real world problems for us building really good ones. The most obvious one is data sharing. So accessibility is something that has been talked about, but we have to think about accessibility both in the context of if you put something on the web and any LLM can access it, then frankly, the benchmark doesn't really survive for very long. It has to be gated in some way, shape, or form. That also, we then have to think about the data sharing and anonymization, pseudonymization issue. There's a reason why, as far as I'm aware, Mimic is the only enormous scale patient data set that actually exists without restriction. There are others like TCGA, which are also without restriction, but those are really very anonymized. This kind of tension will always exist, and I don't think it's necessarily the end of the world, but it has to be thought of in terms of the incentive structures. As Eoin said, there's 5,000 plus data sets on Kaggle, but for many, sharing trial data, things that would be incredibly valuable. So, for example, let's say you want to build a risk prediction model and you want some sort of benchmark data set that's going to help us work out what the best risk prediction model is to use for a particular task in, say, the UK. Well, clearly you can use the UK Biobank if you can afford to access it. But there are other trials that will be often valuable in these kind of areas. But what's the incentive structure for the PIs of these trials to share these data with you for a specific benchmark? Who's going to pay for extracting the data in the right way, keeping it up to date? What platforms exist that mean that we could do this in a privacy preserving manner? Now, surely those could be built, but we haven't done it yet. I think one of the other big things is we really do have to think about line of sight to changing the system. It's nice to have a benchmark. It can be very, very valuable from a research perspective, but the aim of this fundamentally is to find out what the best approach is for a particular task and then to translate that into a clinical setting. So again, looking at the slide that Eoin had of the Nature paper quite recently, where there was a comparison of different cardiovascular disease prediction models, we might find that a new model comes along that's better than the one that we have in practice, and we've developed this through a benchmark. But that's just the beginning of the journey for getting that model into actual clinical practice. And we probably need to think about that translational aspect a little bit more, as otherwise the benchmarks will remain great from a research perspective. People will publish lots of papers, but it won't have as much impact as we would like it to have on the actual clinical coalface. And the last bit that I'm going to talk about is actually coming back to Chris's points. So one of the points that was suggested was that we need a good ground truth. But when we were talking about clinical history taking, which was via the bench and things like that, what is our ground truth? So let's say you move to an autonomous AI system that's increasingly delivering clinical care without much supervision. Say it's being used for triage. Now, that system is a combination of communication and clinical judgment. So you're kind of testing it quite similarly to a human, but your benchmark then is probably the average clinician. But what is the average clinician? We don't really monitor clinicians in the real world, so we have to create quite artificial ways of actually looking at this. The most obvious analogy is something like autonomous vehicles, where we can look at black boxes, so we can actually monitor autonomous vehicles in the real world the entire time. We don't do that with human clinicians, so how would we build a system that would allow us to have this kind of ground truth benchmark for these really complex tasks because AI is on the cusp of moving away from static tasks like reading scans to these slightly more autonomous tasks where there's a communication and a clinical judgment element. So I think we need to do some more work in that particular area as well. And hopefully that leaves us with plenty of time for discussion.
Thanks very much, Tom. I think it's appropriate that we end on some challenges and discussions. I think it's not straightforward. Our definition of what a benchmark is not straightforward. And maybe I could start off our discussion, and please do keep questions coming in and we'll deal with them as they go. But if we could start off the discussion, if I could ask the panelists, first of all, we have over 5,000 data sets on Kaggle. We don't think that there are over 5,000 benchmarks there. So what is a benchmark data set for you? What are the core characteristics? Maybe if I start with you, Chen.
But what's a good benchmark to me? I think actually Chris have already had a very good summary of all the key points. They should be verifiable, they should be scalable, and also should reflect the real world challenge. Yeah, I guess all those things should make sense. But I think more importantly, we really need to get more experts, domain experts on board. I think we are at the point that we almost use up existing documented text available online. So it's really the time we should onboard domain experts to really extract the know-how. So, because many of the knowledge in their experts' mind, they don't necessarily being being write down in text. Uh, I guess that's one important thing to me.
Chen, I think you raised a very interesting point with your bench, which is you raised the how agentic AI might interact here. Because it's one thing to try and have a benchmark data set or a benchmarked model for a very specific task or a very specific process. So I may have a benchmark data set that is a radiology data set like Chris showed us. And that might be a few scans. But actually, if I'm considering a much more complex process like an agentic system, then actually the benchmark data set is no longer a set of scans, but potentially an entire healthcare system. And getting a verifiable, validated healthcare system data set or an entire environment that is itself a benchmark seems much more challenging. But as we go beyond simple ML models into LLMs and through into agentic AI, that seems more and more distant, the possibility of having good benchmark, or harder to get those benchmarks. Do you think it's possible that we can develop those?
I so first of all, I think we internally have the view that we should have adaptive um, benchmark definitely. So we shouldn't rely on static benchmark, but should the benchmark itself should evolve as we develop. So yeah, personally, I think step by step we will get there. The most complex one.
And Tom, you raised the challenge of that. What do you think it's feasible that we'll get those sorts of complex benchmarks as well?
I think if we set the policy right, I think it'll take a lot of time, but I actually think that the AI tools themselves will become the platforms through which we deploy them will become the learning health systems that will give us these ground truth data that we can compare against in the future. So let's say you had an AI system that was an agentic system, as you put it, that's doing something like, I don't know, triage. You might test this on a relatively small set of benchmarks. They might still be quite big in the grand scheme of things, but small comparatively with all the edge cases that it would see in the real world. It's a little bit like licensing a junior doctor. You then might put it into a shadow system for a while to see how it's doing. That would generate an awful lot of data at that point. But I think at the point that you have kind of conditional use of it and it's sort of got registration, as it were, if you build a system that essentially is collecting all the information about its interactions and its outcomes, you could eventually have a very, very rich data set. But I'm making a few leaps here. I'm assuming that that this will be that we can use this kind of outcome-based system to replace the task-based systems that we've had beforehand. And if we do, I think we could have a ratchet effect of massively improving healthcare. But I think it'll take a lot of concerted effort to build that. And I think the regulators are going to have to want something like that. And if they do, and they allow us to, and we can devise a way that pseudonymizes enough data that we can share it, then we'll have a really good system. There's an awful lot of risks that the data doesn't get shared. It becomes a kind of monopolistic type approach, that kind of stuff, which could be really problematic.
The one other aspect that we haven't really touched on that I think is critical, is not just the data set as a benchmark, but the performance itself as a benchmark. So you'll notice with AlphaFold, the goal of solving protein structure folding was defined, very clearly defined down to the number of angstroms that you had to be within to be said to have solved the problem, and that gave them a real target to aim for. And I notice in machine learning models, we constantly come up and we compare five models or six models, including our own, against standards. and we'll show the area under the curve or the ROC values to show that we're better or worse than others. They often perform very similarly. We never quite define how much better you have to be before you've actually made a significant improvement in the context. So I think we not only need to have the benchmark data set, but a benchmark level of performance beyond which we would be said to have solved the problem of predicting outcome in cardiovascular disease or diabetes. Chris, if I come back to you, I'm not aware of good contexts where we have defined those sort of benchmark performance levels. Um, what do you think about that?
No, and it's actually one of the more, I guess, challenging aspects. So in my previous jobs, one of the, I guess, big $1 million or multi-million dollar question was how do we, I guess, get the FDA, for example, to approve, like, say, a radiology AI product? And then that's because we realized that there is no clear definition of what is acceptable in terms of like a machine learning system to be used, say, in healthcare, let's say for radiology even, which we would think by now is very clear, but actually it's not, because like there's like all these discussions and performances, and if we go down to the statistics, there are so many ways you can grind out different ways to frame the numbers to make it look good or not, and also where like the different aspects clinically that would reflect clinical use or not, and then we can go into things such as subgroup analysis and the population differences. It's a whole mess. And then that's before LLMs even. And then these days with LLMs, it was even harder. And internally, we have a joke that, if we can ever get FDA to approve and have any sort of like AI, AGI would have come already. And that's because the biggest problem is that there's no clear definition of of benchmark and what is acceptable, and then what is clinically acceptable, and on also, I guess, to some extent, commercially doable. Because like, if you say, yeah, have a million people randomized control trial, something like that, then obviously, you can prove anything, but it's just not feasible. So then it becomes I guess, to some extent, a trade-off on, yeah, what is doable, what is, yeah, in terms of what we have in data, what we have in model, in personnel, and also, I guess, in the end, and then that's also, I guess, going back to the question, and if there are any people here who are more on the policy and regulation side as well, I think we'd love to chat as well, because then we're also very keen to, yeah, have you on board as well to further discuss this.
Yeah, so I think the message for clinicians here is that if you can share your data, annotate your data, make your data as clean, clear, and transparent as possible, and define your outcomes and achieve consistent, accepted definitions of clinical outcomes, then you're really going to advance your field and make people want to work with you. I guess one way of sharing that might be the generation of synthetic data. And I notice in the questions, Sanjay has raised the question over whether synthetic data, as in some other fields like finance, synthetic data can be used to support these sorts of approaches. Chen, is synthetic something that you're working with frequently in AstraZeneca?
I wouldn't say frequently, but the data set generated by Build-A-Bench itself is synthetic, essentially, because we provide language model the context and appropriate prompt to generate questions. So, but the important part is get experts on board and review the questions being generated. And in the future, I also foreseeing I would love to introduce a peer-reviewed even a mechanism like uh, e- so currently anyone can generate a set of benchmark, but there should be a separation between raw generated benchmark versus peer-reviewed benchmark. Um,
Yeah,
yeah, that
that's an interesting suggestion. And I guess in many ways, a synthetic data set gets you around some of the problems, perhaps the ability to share potentially sensitive data if you can de-identify it and create a synthetic set that cannot be re-identified. But it doesn't get you around the problem that your synthetic set is founded upon a real set, and your real set has to be accepted, has to be generalizable, has to be valid and represent the problem. So you still have to address all those other characteristics of a benchmark data set.
yeah.
Tom, I see there's a specific question for you in the chat here. What would your advice be on creating a good clinical reasoning benchmark?
Gosh.
And maybe we could draw a distinction here, and I think it's an important one between, for example, LLMs that can perform just as well on the USMLE medical qualification exams. They can perform just as well as they can hit the average mark that human participants get. But that does not mean that they can undertake clinical reasoning. And when you put those same LLMs into an EHR environment, can't follow guidelines, can't rational, can't rationalize or diagnose effectively. So there's a very big difference between answering multiple choice questions and actually undertaking clinical reasoning, especially with incomplete information. So accepting that's a hard question, Tom, what would you say?
Um, so I do think that this is a really hard question, and I don't think anybody has really got to the nub of it. So if I take it from, I think you can answer the question in different degrees. And it depends on how automated your task is. If this is something that's going to augment a human clinician, then frankly, you probably can use something like the USMLEs, etc., just to say that it's good enough at learning X, but it's fundamentally the clinician's responsibility to make sure that you're asking the right questions. It might be that you have to have prompt helps, but there are the clinician remains in control in that circumstance. In terms of a critical reasoning benchmark, when you're talking about it doing things kind of without human oversight, which is where we're trying to move, I would have thought, but we're a good 5 to 10 years away from. I think the real difficulty here is defining what your benchmark should be against. So let's say you want to have an automated, I'm going to go back to triage. Let's say you want an automated system for triaging individuals. Now, you need to know how a human would have reacted under those kind of circumstances. So I suppose your benchmark in some respects is, let's say your current process is to have nurses triage people in A&E. I'm going to take that example. Then you probably want a benchmark which is hundreds of cases of the conversations that the nurses had with these individuals in A&E, and you can then turn that into much more complicated, kind of using Chris's Viva bench, you could turn that into a benchmark arena where you've got the LLMs, they're getting the information in the same type of way from actually how people communicate in the real world, because that's fundamentally what you want. That would give you a retrospective benchmark, but you're still going to have to see how people then interact with the AI system if they were to then use that instead of the nurse in the future. And again, this is where I kind of hope that you're going to need almost the equivalent of internal validation, this sort of retrospective benchmark, and a prospective style validation where you put these things into practice and see how they perform. Um, I think you're going to need both. Now, I've seen a few papers where they've done it through randomized trials. They've put clinicians against these kind of systems, and you could use those data definitely as a form of benchmark in the future. But you've got to make sure that you've got enough people, and they've got to reflect enough of the real world. I think that that's going to be kind of key to it. But I also think we have to be realistic in the same way that our current benchmarking approaches for, say, risk prediction models are relatively basic. We use one or two huge data sets often. They're often the same data sets, and then we put something into clinical practice. We measure its calibration and discrimination at a population level, but then we know that the discrimination calibration will vary dramatically depending on where you are in a particular country. So we accept that these things won't necessarily be as good in clinical practice, but this is where I think we need to really think about how we might put those kind of systems into clinical practice. And I do think we need a shift in regulation for that. But in terms of your benchmark, I would go with whatever your human system is at the moment, you need to record it and you need to record the outcomes. And then you can start to use that as a huge test case from which you could even generate more synthetic data. But that would be my guess.
I think that the idea that you need to quantify outcomes and quantify the input is something we could all take a lesson from, and certainly having looked at EHR data, so the data that's input there is highly variable between individuals and highly variable between areas, so it varies a lot. Um, Radek, do you want to unmute yourself and ask a question? I see your
Yes,
hand.
yes. Just a question and a kind of a little bit of a and maybe a perspective, very short. I think that what we are doing so often is we are taking this benchmarking as well as discussing about prediction models and decisions out of context a little bit. We are basically concentrating on one of the elements of decision-making process, which is the induction, generating of information out of data. And of course, it's very important. However, it is all just probability distribution and uncertainty. But I think we maybe would be good, to take it also in the context every time we work on something, do the entire process, which is also the abduction and deduction, which basically meaning, collapsing into the cutoffs, the guidelines, weighing, of the false positives, false negatives, for example, of adverse outcomes, which are not the same, and they're so different for different people for different circumstances. So I think maybe what would be really worthwhile is just to extend it every time the model is being developed to true decision making process, that how it happens in on the front line in medicine in practice.
Okay, thanks, Radek. That's a good point.
Very helpful.
No, good point. I don't think there was a question, but it's a good comment. Thank you. Could I ask Chen one? Sorry, Chen. The one interesting aspect of what you're doing with your bench is you're trying to affect almost crowdsource uh, a benchmark by getting people to respond. And I can see in the questions as well, there's been the point made that we do lack consensus clinical guidelines across a range of areas, and that is a fundamental problem. It has always been the case. There are variable clinical guidelines between different geographies, between different specialties, and even between different postcodes within the same healthcare system. But do you see a role for this sort of wisdom of crowds, or for crowdsourcing validating of benchmarks? So if I have a benchmark that I want to get some validation of, that's difficult without some sort of peer review that you suggested. Do you think the platform you're proposing, could it be used in some way to gain that and to validate more benchmarks?
Yeah, yeah, I'm not sure I fully get the question, but I guess I think certainly we can add lots of feature or label based on different background or geographic location, the reviewers or generator of a benchmark. Are you also suggesting could we actually review existing benchmark on those aspects?
Yes, I guess what I'm saying is that there's a fundamental limitation at the moment where we have 5,500 benchmarks on Kaggle, or data sets on Kaggle. They're not benchmarks because they lack certain things like validation, like
Yeah.
acceptability. Whereas if we could harness expert validation of those data sets, and in some ways that's one aspect of what your if your benching approach was trying to do.
Yeah, yeah. Yes, definitely. I think I guess what we have this prototype is like is just a tool, right? Essentially everyone can generate benchmark, but what more valuable is like if the community join force to a, let's say, open review kind of peer reviewed system for benchmark for clinical benchmark. Um, that would be something very impactful, I think, to some extent, address the challenge.
Okay. And Chris, you also had your Viva bench approach. Is that something that you could see opening up to draw in the validation from others in the field, effectively making your data set public and trying to, I don't know, upvote the one from clinicians? If you get upvoting of the data set that appears to be most valid or most representative, that may be a way of achieving that sort of external validation.
Yeah, yes, definitely. I think so. Yeah, I think one of the characteristics I mentioned in terms of scalability is naturally at odds with, I guess, the input of expert validation. But maybe and I think Fiverr Bench, for example, I've used up all my friendship credits with a few of my physician friends to manually review them, and I think they would not be happy if I give them another 1,000. But going back, rewinding that back a bit, actually, I just want to make a comment as well on the Kaggle dataset observation.
Mm.
So, and it's actually also a new paradigm in that previously everyone is just chucking on healthcare datasets, some of which might be useful and some of it might actually even already have an expert annotation. But because previous paradigm was that we had not necessarily directly intelligent prediction machines, so therefore people can like train models on it. For example, like all the radiology bench, like data sets, right? You train the vision model, and after so you have a train validation split, for example. And then but if you think about it, there's test or validation splits. Those are essentially mini benchmarks of themselves with some adaptation that may or may not already also be expert reviewed. But then the question would, but because these days, as we are moving towards more general intelligence, there's like we don't really like nobody really does say fine tuning anymore, like the way that we used to train models on. And as a result, all of these data is now converted directly as a benchmark, which just probes a general intelligence. So I suspect a lot of low hanging fruit is actually just some, I guess, groundwork to convert existing benchmarks to data sets into benchmarks. And I think that could be quite juicy. And if anyone wants to write a paper about that, let me know. But yeah, I think there's a lot of, I guess, still low hanging fruit to be explored for sure.
Thanks. I can see Shamama, you've got your hand up. Would you like to ask a question?
Yes, Dr. McKinney and Chris, as you mentioned, just as a comment, I'm a physician myself, and currently towards the end of completing my master's in AI and healthcare, which basically sort of gives a lot of perspective and all the hard work that goes behind the scenes by the data manager and IT professionals, I guess. I would agree. In order to create sort of benchmarks, I think we require a much more closer collaboration between clinicians and the data scientists, so that we could come up with these tools which could perhaps sort of be used by across the globe, and which are trustworthy to actually kind of then come up with solutions towards the health issues that we are trying to achieve with the help of AI. And I guess maybe I'm not aware. Maybe there are already such platforms where we could all come together, or perhaps sort of make a new platform where we could all collaborate in order to move forward in this regard.
Good question. So you're really sort of proposing an accepted benchmark for benchmarks, a place where we go to get benchmarks. And I think, if anything, the idea that there are benchmarks for specific purposes, so you may need a benchmark for one task and a different benchmark for another task, means that there is very unlikely to be one benchmark to rule them all, which is repeatedly the case in machine learning, right? There's never one model that's going to dominate and do everything better than any other. So it's a great suggestion. I guess every problem we've outlined with a single benchmark applies to the benchmark of benchmarks. How does it become accepted? How do we know that that's the best one to go to? And you inch towards that. But I agree that if we could get enough momentum from the community to have a single repository of authoritative medical benchmarks, it would be the ideal scenario. Maybe this is where it starts. Maybe we can gather enough momentum to move towards that.
That would be wonderful. Thank you.
Easier said than done, I think, for all the reasons we've just outlined. I think we probably do need to note a couple of things, and really one of them is that there are very few consistent benchmarks uh, in medical performance or in medical treatment. There are a few things that are done very consistently in every place across the world. Practice differs, guidelines differ, and that means that Whereas in the quantitative world of machine learning, we like to think of everything as having a perfect benchmark. That simply is not the case in medicine. Medical practice varies so widely that having one benchmark is unlikely to work. And certainly when we get into more complex systems, like considering a healthcare system as a benchmark for agentic models, for example, healthcare systems vary widely from one hospital to the next, let alone from one country to the next. So I think there will always be a need for multiple benchmarks and therefore much more validation. I think someone also made the very good point that there's a huge amount of work that goes into generating, validating, and creating these benchmarks, and that they're then used and benefited from by many other people. And there's, I think, probably comparatively little credit that filters back to the individuals that put in the hard work to generate it in the first place. And Tom, I think you made that very strong point early on as well. We may need to consider a revision of the way that we reward or recompense or incentivize people to come up with benchmarks, and including for data sharing. So we're just coming up to the hour, and I think it's probably fair to, in summary, say that we've tackled the idea of what a benchmark is, and I certainly hadn't realized I hadn't thought through enough nuance of what defines a benchmark and what makes a good benchmark and how you turn something into a benchmark. And I think in this discussion, I've found out other aspects of it that I hadn't considered before. I think all three of the presentations have highlighted those different aspects of how benchmarks differ, how they can be defined, and some really cool work and really novel angles on how benchmarks are being developed. I realize that we haven't been able to address every single question or comment in the chat, so sorry about that. But thank you to those who have contributed questions, and thanks to those people who have voiced their questions as well. As we're on the hour, Marika, I'm going to pass back to you to see if there's anything else from a logistic point of view you want to say before we close the session.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, it's been fantastic hearing all the discussions and yeah, and also all the questions coming in. So thank you all to the speakers as well for your time today. And thank you all for joining us. This is the last Revolutionizing Healthcare for 2025, and we'd be very excited to see you all back in 2026. Just as an announcement, I guess, we'll be having a bit of an update coming soon for next year's Revolutionizing Healthcare session. So please do keep an eye out for that announcement. And if you did miss out on the start, or if you want to revisit this session, we'll be posting the recorded version on YouTube soon. So please keep an eye out. And of course, as always, please let your colleagues know about the session. And with that, I believe we'll be closing the session today. So thank you all for joining.